Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of super spy James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today we are resuming our series on the Roger Moore Bond films. Last time we talked about The Man with the Golden Gun, which means we are now talking about The Spy Who Loved Me, the third Roger Moore adventure, and probably the most beloved, or at least the most celebrated. The Spy Who Loved Me is an icon in the Bond series. It was a watershed moment for the series after the disappointing performance of The Man with the Golden Gun. In many ways, it's credited with sustaining Bond's success, sustaining the franchise to this day. It was also a transitional moment for Roger Moore's Bond, shifting him from a darker portrayal in the first two films into the iconic British Bond. This sense that Bond is a symbol that represents Britain and stands for Britishness. That's an idea that is really introduced here in The Spy Who Loved Me. It's worth noting that Fleming's Bond has a fairly complicated relationship to his own Britishness. Fleming himself felt like a bit of an outsider when it came to Britishness. His Bond inherits that sort of outsider quality. There's a sense in which Fleming's Bond is always regarding himself as something alien when he's at home in domestic Britain. Indeed, he feels much more at home when he's traveling. There's always these remarks about like how he has tan skin that just makes him stick out. It's no wonder that this is part of the character given Fleming himself, who so loved Jamaica, so loved world travel. This sense of this character, Bond is a character who's really at home abroad. And we see a transition here with The Spy Who Loved Me, where this character really becomes a vessel for Britishness. In many ways, the pre-title sequence of The Spy Who Loved Me, in which Bond parachutes off a cliff in one of the grandest stunts of the series, one of the most iconic and breathtaking moments the series has ever had to offer, and parachutes off, and it's a Union Jack parachute connected to the Bond theme. It's a moment that effectively redefines what the character signifies, and that redefinition carries through into the title sequence. Nobody Does It Better is a very different kind of Bond song than any Bond song that had previously occurred. It's almost sentimental about the character. It treats Bond as a beloved friend that we're seeing once again, and does that through the language of love a little bit there. But this shift from Bond, from this hardened, darker character, if you think about the songs that had been written about Bond before in the Connery era, which the two most strong examples would be, Thunderball and its companion song, which never received lyrics in the film but appears throughout the same movie, Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. They describe this fairly dark, almost threatening character. Here in The Spy Who Loved Me, this character is an established icon, a beloved figure. And it's no shocker that Nobody Does It Better has become like the go-to song for all those beloved all those celebrations of the Bond franchise as a familiar companion. It's always Nobody Does It Better playing over clips of the Bond series to kind of sentimentalize our relationship to the Bond films. And it's interesting to see that take place in this movie because it hasn't quite left the old Bond behind. We have to remember that when Connery's Bond is introduced in Dr. No, he's a pretty dark character. This is a character who, in one of the most famous scenes at Dr. No, shoots a character in the back who is already dying just to make him feel pain on his way out the door to the next life. There's a sadistic quality to Connery's Bond, a sort of latent cruelty in Connery's Bond, and that carries through in Roger Moore's portrayal in Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun. There's a sort of dark ruthlessness about the Bond character here. And it does still persist a bit into The Spy Who Loved Me. You get moments in The Spy Who Loved Me where he turns a woman into the path of a bullet. And he, memorably drops a henchman off the roof after the henchman has already given him the information that he asked for. There's a sense of that darkness still here in Bond. It's gonna soften a bit as the films go on. Even Roger Moore famously is very uncomfortable with the moment when we get to For Your Eyes Only, where he kicks a villain's car off the cliff. Roger Moore has famously said in interviews that he was somewhat uncomfortable with that moment of darkness. That darkness is still very present here by the time we're in The Spy Who Loved Me. But this is definitely a transitional shift for the character. Indeed, we start to see this version of Bond, who previously was fairly aloof, condescending, emotionally detached in many ways, and very arrogant, have moments of tenderness and sentimentality. His relationship with Agent XXX, Anya, is somewhat tender, somewhat soft. There's that moment where they're at the bar and Anya brings up Bond's previous marriage, and we get confirmation that Roger Moore's Bond is indeed the same Bond we saw in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, when he kind of flinches at the recollection of his beloved deceased wife. And we'll see her grave actually appear in For Your Eyes Only a few films down the road. So that sort of tenderness starts to creep in, and it's a nice element for Roger Moore's Bond to play to, because in fact, Roger Moore's persona has such a natural warmth that it feels like he leans into those moments very organically. I have often thought that in many ways, if Roger Moore had been cast in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he may have very well excelled in that film. I like George Lazenby in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I look forward to talking about that film when I get to it. But there is a softer side to Roger Moore's persona, a natural tenderness, a sort of generosity of spirit that would have worked, I think, very well in a story about Bond getting married. And I think you start to see some of those shades appear here in The Spy Who Loved Me. It'll appear in some of the later films where his relationships with women become a little bit more complex, a little bit more mature, a little bit more multifaceted. And I actually think Roger Moore is fairly capable at portraying that. In many ways, he's kind of setting a precedent that Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan in particular will later build on as more romantic-leaning Bonds. It's definitely a shift from the Connery Bond, who really, it's hard to imagine what it would be like for Connery's Bond to be truly tender. He doesn't really have a moment that registers that way in the films. Now, that said, let's talk about the way this film really contextualizes Bond, because this is a film, like we said, it introduces Bond as a symbol, right? He parachutes off with the Union Jack. He says England needs him. When he was reintroduced into the film after the pre-title sequence, he's wearing a naval uniform. It's like Britishness, Britishness, Britishness. The film's going to end with him quipping about keeping the British end up, right? This is a through line this movie does not want us to forget. And as this sort of symbolic vessel, he is put against what is arguably the series' most grand canvas. I think one reason The Spy Who Loved Me is looked on with such affection is it just feels enormous. And part of that is the cinematography, this enormous widescreen feel with all these enormous wide shots, right? And we get that throughout this movie, but it's also in the locations. And one thing the series has done throughout, but is really leaned into here and is revisited again in Moonraker to a certain extent, is this idea this Bond being caught between the ancient world and almost like a futuristic world, right? Stromberg's world is a science fiction world that he wants to create where everybody's just going to live under the sea. It's kind of a crazy idea, but it's like it's drawn with a lot of futurism, and Ken Adams' sense of futurism as a production designer often introduces a lot of those sort of like Victorian Baroque aspects of European aristocracy. You get that sense colliding in Stromberg's Atlantis laboratory, but it is this sense that Bond is kind of caught between that futurism and like the very ancient past. Bond spends a lot of this movie in the ancient parts of the world, meaning primarily Egypt here, really. It is a film that so beautifully is situating Bond against all these great icons, the pyramids, the temples, the tombs, and that has a way of reinforcing Bond as an icon, because it almost strips him out of the world and puts him in this sort of context where he's just almost purely iconography. When you see Bond walking, through past like Abu Simbel, it's hard to register that as like a secret agent operating in the world of espionage. It is a surrealist visual of like of a character that it's kind of subliminally signaling that this character is almost like immortal. He's like above time. He sits above time. And we'll get that again in Moonraker to a lesser extent with the way that it pulls in the South American temples and sort of that sort of Mayan legacy there a little bit. But here it's done in such a gorgeous way. I in many ways, the sequence at the pyramids is maybe my single favorite sequence in the Roger Moore era, just for the sheer grandeur of it, as well as combining with that element that I said I liked so much in The Man with the Golden Gun, that sort of surreal aspect, that sort of nightmarish fever dream aspect. Jaws becomes a comedy character by the time you get to Moonraker, but here he's still very much a peculiar character pitched between horror and comedy. He's kind of veering back between those extremes, but he's very much part of that tradition of like the Fleming horror elements here, where the language of film that's applied when he is attacking his victims is very much like a gothic horror story sort of vampire feeling. And as much as the character has a sort of strange silliness about his behavior, those moments do register as threatening, and that's incorporated in the midst of this wonderful like sort of stalking sequence amidst the pyramids with the lights and the narration. It's very strange. It's very uncanny. And I love that sequence so much. I feel like that sequence is everything I want in a James Bond movie. And in many ways, the Egypt sequence of The Spy Who Loved Me is something I love so much that I really wish I could say that I love the rest of the movie to the same extent. Because I think this movie has a real problem with its villain. I think Stromberg is kind of a nothing character, and it's unfortunate that he's such a nothing character, because he becomes a center point once he and Bond meet, which is about a little bit after the Egypt section concludes, and that's when I think a lot of the momentum just disappears from this movie, because there's just not as much intrigue there at that point. Bond and Stromberg have their meeting, and it's actually one of the more inert scenes in the movie. In fact, it's surprising because Roger Moore usually comes alive so dramatically when he's put into the room with a villain. We saw that in Live and Let Die. We saw that in The Man with the Golden Gun. We're going to see that again when he's with Kamal Khan in Octopussy. Roger Moore has such a talent for doing that sort of wordplay with a villain, but Stromberg just doesn't have much to give Bond to go off of. In fact, it's interesting to really think that Stromberg is in many ways the first truly, like, true, unabashed, like, madman villain of the series, in the sense that his motivations don't really make any sense at all. You kind of feel the sense that he's been artificially constructed to make sense of the story, which is, if you know the behind-the-scenes story of how The Spy Who Loved Me came together, is like they kind of came up with the submarine stuff and then tried to figure out motivations after the fact, which is not that different from how the other stories are written. But in the sense, you kind of feel Stromberg is really a placeholder. They never really figured out who this character was. He's an image of decaying European aristocracy, but he's also a scientist, and he's kind of crazy, and he's got webbed fingers, and yeah, he just kind of likes the sea a lot. I think it's a mix that works a lot better in Moonraker. I think Drax kind of helps make that all come together with a little bit more clarity in terms of motivation, in terms of persona, in terms of attitude towards Bond. Whereas Stromberg just feels kind of like a weird, not Blofeld sort of character, and it just doesn't help, because so much of the rest of the movie is focused on what Stromberg is trying to do, and it's kind of a nonsensical plot to begin with, and Bond's animosity with Stromberg doesn't really hold a lot of charge. So, as much as The Spy Who Loved Me is one of the most celebrated Bonds, I have to say, personally, I actually kind of rank it towards the lower end of the Roger Moore era, despite having some of the highest highs of the Roger Moore era. I feel like the back half of this movie is just a lot of dead weight. The stuff in the tanker just kind of goes on forever without a lot of, like, really exciting momentum. I love the, like, big army sort of battles that we don't really get in Bond anymore. I hope we get some in future Bond films, because I think that's a big part of the spectacle, seeing these, like, armies of soldiers kind of swarming together. But it's also the case that they tend to be, you know, just full of, like, a lot of, like, coverage shots of people just kind of getting shot here and there, nameless bad guy thugs and nameless good guy heroes shooting at each other. And I think the tankers kind of falls on the wrong end of that. I think it just needed to be tighter. But that said, as much as I've said that I don't really love the Bond-Stromberg dynamic, the scene where Bond finally confronts Stromberg brings back that same ruthless edge that we've talked about kind of persisting into The Spy Who Loved Me, that kind of carries over, as much as the character is pivoting here into a softer version of the Roger Moore Bond that will then carry forward through the rest of his era. That's the way he dispatches Stromberg is so ruthless and so clear to Bond's role as this sort of ruthless assassin character that it works really well. Something about Roger Moore being ruthless, in part because he's able to occupy such, like, extremes of the character, works really well for me. You expect that sort of moment from Sean Connery's Bond, but when Roger Moore's Bond goes there in places like in The Spy Who Loved Me, it lands with a little extra zing, because the character has a little bit more of a spectrum of emotional bandwidth. So again, when we get to the For Your Eyes Only, when he, like, kicks the car off the cliff, it's the same kind of thing that I enjoy there. That sort of, like, burst of unexpected, you know, just anger is really satisfying when it comes from Roger Moore's Bond, and I really enjoy that conflict there. I also enjoy the final entanglement with Jaws. It's a little, again, Jaws is kind of this weird character that's a little bit hokey and a little bit threatening, and there's something fun about that final confrontation in the sense that it's continually playing with both of those extremes. You know, and again, the sets by Ken Adam are some of the grandest ever, so it's hard to complain too much about a back half of the movie that spends a lot of time in those gorgeous illuminated sets. Let's talk about Anya for a second. We've already brought her up, but Anya is introduced in a sequence that is very clearly establishing her as the female 007. This is the introduction of that trope, and it's been around with us so long in the series that we now have a literalized female 007 in No Time to Die. But Anya is the idea that she's really this peer for Bond, and the two of them are kind of have this cat and mouse game for the first part of this movie. And I think that's one of the things that helps that first half feel really exciting, whereas the second half loses a little bit of that luster, is the interplay between the two of them. They're kind of always trying to checkmate the other. And I don't think Anya is an especially strong character as written. She's fine. She works well in the scene she's in. She's not especially memorable apart from, you know, her core dynamic with Bond. But I really enjoy that sort of cat and mouse aspect. And I also enjoy this sort of framing device that, unfortunately, the movie just kind of throws away at the end, but this idea that Bond has killed her beloved in the opening sequence, and that she really has to wrestle with this idea of, is she going to kill James Bond? Because they're partners, and they've shared some intimate moments together. This tension is actually very interesting in the scene where they kind of both connect that together, and Moore's Bond has to give that sort of monologue about, you know, sometimes things just kind of get messy, and that's the rules of the game. That sort of dynamic is very satisfying. It's unfortunate that the film just kind of like tosses it away with a hand wave in the last few minutes, rather than resolving it in a way that has a little bit more potency. It's something that you kind of are like, you know, in the same way that the Brosnan and Craig eras kept picking up ideas from the prior films and kind of exploring them in more dramatic ways. It would have been an interesting premise for one of, you know, the Craig movies to have picked up that idea and kind of like done a more dramatic rendition of it. But in the context of this movie and how this movie is celebrating Bond as a symbol, it's just, there's never really any tension that Bond is going to die. He is the invulnerable icon of Britishness, right? So the way the movie resolves that with a sort of gag and the final quip and the chorus version of Nobody Does It Better, which is very camp and outrageous. That's whole finale really is that, you know, cementing the idea that this Bond is invulnerable. So it's not an arc that we're meant to ever take that seriously. It's something that's just there to add a little bit of seasoning as we go along. But I think the movie does fairly well with that, in the sense that I really enjoy when Moore is given a female character to play with that is really kind of like forcing them to stretch each other. And you see that here, you see that to an extent in the next few movies, to more or less successful extents. But it is a very satisfying dynamic that I think this movie starts to unlock. So in a lot of ways, you're seeing The Spy Who Loved Me unlock these ideas that get, you know, more robustly explored in the subsequent movies. Moonraker, which I'm very excited to talk about because I like Moonraker a great deal. I like Moonraker more than I like The Spy Who Loved Me, despite it having lower lows than some of The Spy Who Loved Me's lows. Is almost a beat-for-beat replay of The Spy Who Loved Me in some ways. So, there we go. I've talked about The Spy Who Loved Me. Let me know your thoughts on this movie. I feel like this is the film that really cemented the character as we understand the character today. Without The Spy Who Loved Me, without this sense of Bond as symbol, you don't get all the storyline in Skyfall about Bond being, you know, the emblem of Britishness, this sort of bulldog symbol that the movie literalizes there. This scene with Daniel Craig's Bond on the rooftop looking at the Union Jack. That, to me, all has its genesis here. And, for better or worse, introduces a kind of weird dissonance in the character, because the character is a character that does unsavory work, right? That's kind of established from the start in the Fleming archetype, is reinforced in the way Connery's Bond carries himself, but is now forced to straddle this line between being that darker character and also being this more heroic icon that we all cherish and love as kind of like a beloved archetype. And that tension has never been fully resolved from The Spy Who Loved Me on. It's just kind of coexisted throughout the remainder of the series. And I think that's what makes The Spy Who Loved Me really interesting. So let me know what you think about that. Let me know what you think about the film. Obviously, it's very beloved. I'm probably on the wrong side of history a little bit here, but my opinions are my own. So come at me as you see fit. And I'll catch you in the next one where we're going to talk about Moonraker.